Good morning. I'm Dr. Barry Maron, and I am speaking to you from Minneapolis, where I work at the Minneapolis Heart Institute Foundation. I am sorry that I can't be in Washington for this conference, and I thought that in my absence I would share some thoughts about cardiovascular disease in athletes with you. This has been an idea that really began in the early 1980s, so it's about 30 years old, become an area of cardiovascular medicine through growth related to the causes of sudden death in young athletes, issues of pre-participation screening and eligibility and disqualification standards. And as a result has become a complex area, far more so than back in the early 1980s when we were just beginning to identify the diseases that were responsible for these catastrophes. Well, it's an interesting story, actually, that goes back to the early 1980s. Interestingly enough, prior to that involvement, while I was at NIH in Bethesda, the sudden deaths of young athletes were explained as some type of mysterious sudden death syndrome, quote unquote. So the idea that these athletic field deaths that we're now very familiar with were due to underlying cardiovascular disease was not part of the landscape at all. There really was no data and no explanation in the cardiovascular literature for these events. And what happened in the early 1980s, there were 2 deaths in the University of Maryland basketball program in College Park. Owen Brown, Chris Patton were 2 members of the intercollegiate basketball program who died within about 2 to 3 weeks of each other. There was a lot of controversy about what the causes were of those events. And that caused us to start to look at this question because we were there. We found that one of the 2 athletes, in fact, had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and the other had died of a ruptured aorta, probably related to the Marfan syndrome. So that began the investigation. We started collecting cases of athletes that we could prove had underlying cardiovascular disease as one type or another, and found even then that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy was most common. We put together a paper which had 29 athletes in it. It's a very small group. I recall Mel Chetlin, who was one of the editors of Circulation, was very concerned about the size but agreed to publish the data anyway. There's really nothing in that paper, which I believe is 1982, that we haven't found to be correct since. Had a variety of diseases that were causes of certain athletic field deaths in competitive participants. And that started the registry that is now more than 30 years old that I've kept up after I left Bethesda and came to Minneapolis. We have now tracked over 2,500 of these young sudden deaths in athletes specifically. But I must say the distribution of diseases and the causes are not dramatically different than that first very small group of 29 that's published in Circulation. Let me say this about introductory participation screening. It's more complicated than it might look to those who haven't put a lot of thought into it. First of all, the American Heart Association document in 2007, which is sort of a point of contention for some, clearly is not anti-screening. In fact, it promotes the idea of individual screening efforts in the community. So if there is, for example, a tragedy in a community or at a university or college, and there is a desire to do something, thereby screen athletes for cardiovascular disease to prevent such a tragedy from occurring again, the American Heart Association official position is in favor. The American Heart Association position that is not in favor of screening is this idea of a national mandatory screening program that would be federally funded and required, that would somehow obliterate this problem. That doesn't make a lot of sense in a number of ways, in practical terms, but also ethically, because the idea of limiting this screening program to those who sign up for high school sports or are involved in college sports in a way is discriminatory when you think about it. There are more individuals in this age group that we're talking about who are at risk for sudden cardiac death or who die suddenly who are not athletes, because the population of non-athletes is obviously greater than the population of athletes. So to limit a mandatory program to competitive athletes really doesn't make any sense and would not be sustainable on close scrutiny. Yeah, I think the final message here is that the problem of cardiovascular disease in young people, including athletes, is a very important one. These are largely genetic heart diseases that occur not only in athletes but other young people. And the impetus to place a focus on these diseases is very important. I think the college is correct to do so, and there's a lot of work left to be done.